For given that God has created us with freedom of the will, it follows that he cannot guarantee that all persons will freely give their lives to him and be saved. The Bible makes it very clear that God desires every person to be saved, and by his Spirit he seeks to draw every person to himself. The only obstacle to universal salvation is therefore human free will.
I think it is important within the Christian life to ask big questions. If you're a professing Christian, why would you not want to ask questions about God? Why would you not want to ask introspective questions about yourself? Why would you not want to examine deeper the veracity of your beliefs and the veracity of what you profess? I think it's generally accepted in academic and scientific communities that truth is come to many times through the asking of questions. If you ask good questions and you seek out the answers to those questions, I think you're bound to stumble upon the very fibers of truth that make up reality. A few weeks ago, I was attending a Christian small group. The small group consists of people roughly my age. And we were discussing various things relating to the topic that night. I think we were in the book of Philippians. And eventually the conversation just turned to general random questions that were coming up. And at this point, my friend beside me asked this question. If God made us, and we had no say in that process, we had no choice in the matter whether he made us or not, but if God made us, then why would he not be obligated to take care of us? Why would he not be obligated to save us right off the bat and guarantee us a place in heaven no matter what? Why would it be the case that God made us, we had no choice in the matter, and yet we can still end up in hell? That just seems unfair. And to be honest, I sat there kind of perplexed because I was like, that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought of that in that way before. And I commended him on the question, and then I said, I think I'll have to get back to you on that one because I don't really have an answer for you right at this moment. And he was fine with that. But then that question started to bother me that evening and in the following days and weeks. And it really took me until now to come up with a good way to at least begin to answer this question. So in the spirit of asking and answering big questions and seeking truth, I'm going to try and answer that question that my friend had, at least in part. The question, again, said in a slightly different way, is this: why doesn't God automatically grant to all people a saving relationship with himself? After all, if we had no choice in whether or not we were born, it would seem unfair for God to do anything less. The first thing I think we need to bring up in this conversation is the overarching theology for the existence of man. Why does man exist? The Westminster Catechism answers that question like this. It says, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Or as some say, man's chief end is to glorify God by enjoying him forever. And the idea there is that man's sole purpose on earth is to bring glory to God. And some argue that is through enjoying God. So the most pure form of glorifying God is truly enjoying him. And this makes sense because, as pastor and theologian John Piper has pointed out countless times throughout his career, one of the best ways to show somebody's value or to show them appreciation or to glorify them, so to speak, is to show them that you enjoy them. One of the greatest compliments you could give to a spouse or a partner is to say, I enjoy being with you. I enjoy you as a person. And that brings them glory, so to speak, or that uplifts them in a way that almost nothing else could. But simply stated, the purpose of all humans is to bring God glory and to enjoy God. And the Westminster Catechism uses verses like 1 Corinthians 10:31, Romans 11:36, Psalm 73:24 through 26, John 17:22 and 24, and Isaiah 43:7 as backing for this claim or this doctrinal statement. So the second point, or the second question we want to ask in this discussion is, how did God make people? And by this, I don't necessarily mean how did he physically make them or what was the process of physically creating people. I mean, how did he create people in the sense of autonomy, free will, willpower, accountability, those sorts of things. And again, I'm not going to claim to answer this by any stretch of the imagination in its entirety. Honestly, I personally have struggled with this point in my own theology, in my own life. For a while, I leaned a lot more heavily deterministic, meaning that I felt like people had very little free will, that God determined people's steps completely, and that there was little choice in one's life. As I studied and as I thought about this issue, however, I've started to lean a lot more heavily to a quote-unquote free will view of Christianity, because honestly, I think a free will view of Christianity is more consistent with what we see in the Bible, and I also believe it works more heavily to the end of glorifying God than a deterministic view of Christianity would. And I know that's a polarizing issue, and like I said, I myself struggle with it. I still do to this day. To answer the second question, though, or to deal with the second point, I do think people were created with a free will, or with the ability to be held accountable or held culpable for their actions. I think we see that in the Genesis account because both Adam and Eve were presented with a world where they could choose. They had a choice that they could make. They could choose to live their life in bliss with God for eternity, seemingly, or they could disobey God and eat the fruit that God told them not to eat. They were presented with a choice. And though I think the free will of humans was maybe dull or lost its edge a little bit after Adam and Eve disobeyed because of the curse of sin, I do think that people still do have free will. What I mean by our free will having lost its edge or having been dulled after the original sin of Adam and Eve is that I think because of Adam and Eve's sin, we have been given this sin nature. There will always be sin in our lives. I don't think anyone can ever completely choose to be free of sin. So humanly speaking, I do think that an edge has been taken off of our free will or our free ability to choose, but I do still think that people have free will, and I think that's evident in everyday life, and I think that is evident in that we will be judged ultimately for our choices. We will be judged for our lives, for our lifestyles, for our choice of whether we choose to know Jesus or not. I think it is the most theologically and biblically consistent to say that people do have free will and that their choices do matter. So looking back, we've seen, one, that people exist to give God glory and to enjoy God forever. And then secondly, we have seen that people do have free will. People were created with a certain amount of autonomy and free will. They were created with the ability to choose good or evil, God or self, which ultimately means that they can be held responsible for their choices. They can be culpable for their wrongdoing. So this brings us to our third point, and it is in this point that I will try to answer our original question. The two previous points have been build up to this point, and I think they are necessary building blocks to come to this third point. So the question again is something like this. If God made us, and we had no say in that process, we had no choice in the matter whether he made us or not, but if God made us, then why would he not be obligated to take care of us? Why would he not be obligated to save us right off the bat and guarantee us a place in heaven no matter what? Why is it fair that God would send some to heaven and some to hell? Why isn't everyone treated equally if everyone has the equal starting point of not having a choice of whether to exist or not? Like I said, I think the answer to this question is grounded in our first 2 points. So it is grounded in the fact that people are made for God's glory, and it is grounded in the fact that people are culpable for their decisions, that people are accountable for their right and wrong doing. So the answer to our initial question, I think, is something like this. It is fair for God to send some people to heaven and some people to hell, although we had a seemingly even starting point, because we were created for a purpose, and we have the choice of whether or not to fulfill that purpose. I thought of an analogy that I think does an okay job of trying to explain this. So say you were a young man in the 1940s, and you were drafted into the U.S. military to go fight overseas in the Second World War. Assuming that you were a law-abiding citizen and didn't dodge the draft, you really had no choice of whether or not to go into the military. You were drafted. It is your obligation to join the military. You have no choice but to be trained as a warrior, be trained as a soldier, and go to war. You report for duty and you go through basic training. They train you to be a soldier. They make you into a warrior to fight for the United States and to fight for the Allies. In other words, you were trained for a purpose. You're a warrior that was made for a purpose. So being made for this purpose, you are sent out into the front lines of battle. You hear that the opposing side, that the enemy, is willing to pay handsomely and reward handsomely for any information on the Allies. They want a traitor. So seeing this opportunity, you're intrigued. You would like to be a wealthy, powerful man. You would like to not have to suffer on the battlefield. So you approach the other side and you say, I'll be your traitor, I'll be your double agent, I'll be your spy. So time goes on. The Allied powers eventually dominate the Axis powers. And the Axis powers, the side that you decided to become a traitor for, have fallen. Now, because the Axis powers have fallen, they rat you out. They tell the Allies you were a traitor all along, that you sold them information for power, prestige. Now, I ask you, at this point, what obligation do the Allies, does the United States, who trained you to be a warrior, what obligation do they have to you now? I would argue that they have no obligation to you. They have no obligation to be merciful to you. They have no obligation to try to save you from the situation you've put yourself in, because you were a traitor. You abandoned them. You betrayed them. So they have no obligation to you. You were made a warrior for a purpose. Even though you had no choice in whether to be made a warrior or not, you were made a warrior for a purpose. And you did not fulfill that purpose. You turned your back on that purpose. You betrayed your country. And so your country now has no obligation to you. I think something very similar is happening with God and people. Though people don't necessarily choose that they come into existence, they do have a choice as to whether they fulfill the purposes of God or not. Those who do come to know Jesus and those who glorify God through that relationship are rewarded for that. And those who do not fulfill that purpose and who do not come to know God and who do not glorify God are punished. Now, even if you were following me all the way through my first, second, third point, through my analogy, and you understood all that, there could very well still be bigger questions in your mind or more ultimate questions that I didn't delve into. And that's where I admit I don't have anywhere close to all the answers to the questions that could be contained in this subject matter, in this topic. Like I said, I'm just trying to scratch the surface and to begin a conversation on these things and to put forth some ideas that I had. But I appreciate your watching this video, and if you'd like to see more videos that I've made, I'll link a couple of them at the end of the video here, and you can check out my channel, Theological Theory. And if you like this content, feel free to click the subscribe button and the little bell icon next to the subscribe button. It really helps me out when you do that. So thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.